Hey, it's Craig. I just wanted to let you know that you can listen to Canadian History X early and ad-free on Amazon Music, included with Prime. Hey everyone, Craig Baird here. Before I begin today's story, I want to take a moment and ask that you check me out on Patreon at www.patreon.com/CanadaEHX. There are several tiers with great benefits, from ad-free content to t-shirts and other cool stuff. And if you're a fan of Canadian History X, make sure you check out my other shows, From John to Justin and Canada, A Yearly Journey. And don't forget, you can also donate directly to the show at www.canadaehx.com. It helps keep this show going. All right, on with the show.
A listener's note. The following episode contains coarse language, adult themes, and content of a violent and disturbing nature, and may not be suitable for everyone. Listener discretion is advised.
According to the Spartacus Gay Travel Guide, Canada is the #1 safest country for the 2S LGBTQ+ community. But as we know, things are far from perfect and there's still lots of work to be done. Looking at you, my home province of Alberta. But getting to this point took a lot of work by many courageous people who stood up and fought against an oppressive system that denied their rights to exist. Some saw them as mentally ill in the best case, and dangerous offenders who deserved jail time in the worst case. Many still carry criminal charges in their records. There are so many members of the 2S LGBTQ+ community and their allies that have worked to improve Canada, and I would like to take a moment now to thank them for their efforts, and today I'm going to share a few of their stories. I'm Craig Baird, this is Canadian History X, and join me as we journey through the 1950s to the 2000s to learn the story of Canada's LGBTQ2S+ history. In Canada, it is illegal to be fired from your job because of your sexual orientation. Quebec was the first province and major jurisdiction in the world to ban discrimination on the grounds of sexual orientation. It enshrined that right in 1978 in its Quebec Charter for Human Rights and Freedoms. Canada doesn't explicitly grant or deny any such right in its constitution, but the Supreme Court has ruled that Section 15(1) of the Canada Charter of Rights and Freedoms does protect against discrimination, including sexual orientation. It is as enshrined as possible without being in the Constitution. But back in the 1950s, a person could not only lose their job, but the federal government and RCMP were actively trying to out them. If you were a gay man in that era, working for the federal government in any capacity, there was a chance you would find yourself sitting in a chair, looking at a television screen, displaying pornographic images while your pupil responses were measured. Called the fruit machine by those who administered the test, it was invented by Dr. Frank Robert Wake, a psychology professor out of Carleton University. He based his machine on a study done in the United States that measured the pupil sizes of subjects as they walked through the aisles of a grocery store to gauge their emotional reactions to products. Dr. Wake was sent to the United States by the Canadian government to study similar devices used there, and in his travels, he also met with Alan Seltzer of the University of Chicago, who claimed he could distinguish gay men from straight men through a series of pictures in a box. After a year in the United States, Dr. Wake returned to Canada, where he built his machine. But why was the federal government interested in outing people in the civil service, armed forces, and RCMP? At the time, it was a commonly held belief that gay men suffered from a mental illness and had weak character. During the Cold War, the government saw gay men as a security risk. In their paranoia, they believed that they could be turned into Soviet spies by agents who preyed upon their quote-unquote weaknesses. In one 1959 American study, it was stated, "Homosexuals often appear to believe that the accepted ethical code which governs normal human relationships does not apply to them." To determine this so-called security risk, the government began to compile a list of men in its employ that were suspected of being gay, but the process was taking too long. So the government turned to Dr. Wake to build his device. If a federal employee was suspected of being gay, they were called to a room for the purposes of undergoing a stress test. The subjects sat in what looked like a dentist's chair, and as their heart rate was analyzed, images of naked men and women were displayed. A person next to the subject would analyze the size of the subject's pupils and measure any changes through a camera. Another test had a subject hold a bag of cobalt chloride and silica gel in their hand as they read quote-unquote homosexual words like circus, bagpipe, blind, camp, fish, and so. The test was supposed to measure changes in moisture, as it was believed that sweat would change the color of the crystals. It goes without saying that the accuracy of these tests was highly questionable. The pupil measurement was based on a flawed assumption that an involuntary reaction could be measured scientifically, or that gay and straight people would respond differently. Another issue was the ability to measure any changes in the pupil size accurately, which would be near impossible using equipment of the time as pupils contracted or expanded for less than 1 millimeter. Despite all of this, the device was used until 1967, when the Defense Research Board finally pulled funding. But the damage it did to the lives of those who lost their jobs because of it is immeasurable. While no exact numbers are known, it's believed many civil service employees, soldiers, and RCMP officers were either demoted without cause or lost their jobs. What is known is that the device allowed the RCMP to collect files and data on over 9,000 people. In the 1990s, Dr. Wake addressed his role in the creation of the machine and its impact by stating, "I think it was worth doing because it might have brought us a lot of knowledge about homosexuals." In 2017, Prime Minister Justin Trudeau apologized in the House of Commons for the government's actions on the matter and for using Dr. Wake's machine. One of those impacted by the government's use of pseudoscience would become a Canadian human rights activist who launched a landmark legal challenge in the Federal Court of Canada against the military's discriminatory policies against LGBTQ+ service members. And her name? Michelle Douglas. Born in 1963 in Ottawa, Ontario, Michelle Douglas earned a Bachelor of Arts in Law in 1985 and later joined the Canadian Armed Forces in 1986 and became the first woman to be promoted to the Special Investigation Unit. For years, she had known she was attracted to women, but it was something she kept hidden because it could risk her military career. She had been promoted to the unit that was responsible for finding homosexuals in the armed forces. It didn't take long before rumors began to swirl about Douglas's sexuality. These rumors led to an investigation in 1988 to determine if Douglas was a lesbian. While under investigation, she was taken to a hotel room where 2 male officers questioned her about her sexual activities with women and told her she should like men. Soon after, she was transferred to another unit and lost her security clearance. There was nothing to warrant this demotion, as she had an exemplary service record. In 1989, she was released from the armed forces because she was a lesbian. On her release form, it stated, "Not advantageously employable due to homosexuality." This was part of the LGBTQ purge that began in the 1950s and was helped along by Dr. Wake. But Michelle Douglas had a legal background, and she launched a $550,000 lawsuit against the Department of National Defense in January 1990. Likely because they knew they would lose the trial, the Department of National Defense abandoned its policy of banning gays and lesbians from serving in the military and settled the case with Douglas in 1992. This made Canada one of the first countries to openly allow LGBTQ individuals to serve in the military. With the end of her military career, Douglas devoted herself to many worthwhile causes. She served as the chair of the Foundation for Equal Families and the chair of the board of the 519 Church Street Community Centre in Toronto. She was a founding member of the Rainbow Railroad LGBT Refugee Organization and currently serves as a member of the board of directors of Michelle Jean Foundation. In 2000, she was named a Pride Parade Marshal in Toronto, and on December 13, 2023, Minister of National Defense Bill Blair appointed her as the first honorary colonel for professional conduct and culture. Michelle Douglas has devoted herself to furthering LGBTQ2S+ rights in Canada, and at the heart of it is the right to love who you love. One man put his heart on his sleeve and changed the perception of gay men by doing just that. His name was Jim Egan. In the spring of 1948, Jim Egan met Jack Nesbitt for the first time at the Sovereign Hotel in Toronto, a popular place for the LGBTQ2S+ community to meet during a time when being gay was illegal. In his book, Challenging the Conspiracy of Silence, Jim Egan wrote, "I was smitten with Jack." Both Jim and Jack went on with their lives after that first meeting, but 2 weeks later, they met again at the King Cole Room at the Park Plaza Hotel. Jack was sitting with some friends and Jim sat a little distance away from them. At one point, Jack walked over and said, "I've been asking all these guys if they want to go steady with me, and none of them will. How about you? Would you like to go steady with me?" Initially shocked by how upfront Jack was, Jim stated they should at least go on a date first. The next night, they had their first date. It was simple, a long walk together. By August 23, 1948, they made a commitment to date each other. With the support of Jack, Jim felt more at ease being a gay man. He decided to tell his mother, who told him that if he was happy, that's all that mattered to her. Jim wrote in his book, "When I brought Jack home for the first time, she took to him like another son, and they had a wonderful relationship for as long as she lived." Jack's parents also welcomed Jim into the family and treated him like a second son. Jack's mother told him, "You know, now I can die happy because Jack's found someone who can look after him." Jim and Jack's parents' welcome was the exception, not the norm at the time. In Toronto, gay people had to keep their love secret. If discovered, not only did they face jail time, but they would lose their job. Following the Second World War, there was also an increasing amount of press maligning gay people with articles meant to inflame the public and limit understanding for the gay community. Papers such as Justice Weekly freely spoke of, quote, disgusting sex orgies and the, quote, limp wrist club. Jack worked for the provincial audit office at Queen's Park and could in no way come out at the risk of losing his job. In contrast, Jim was self-employed, and that gave him the security to take a stand. Beginning in 1949, Jim wrote letters and articles advocating for gay rights in Canada. And for the next 15 years, he wrote letters to the Globe and Mail, Toronto Star, and other publications that presented the LGBTQ2S+ community in a prejudiced light. In one piece he wrote, "The acceptance and integration that every thinking, responsible homosexual desires will come someday." But this was not without cost. In 1963, Jack told his partner he couldn't handle the growing attention that Jim was receiving for his activism. Jim said, "Activism was very important to me. I couldn't just walk away from it." Because of this, the pair broke up. But Jim Egan's persistence, along with other members of the community and their allies, began to effect changes. Slowly, publications moved away from publishing damning articles that condemned the LGBTQ2S+ community. In 1964, The Homosexual Next Door was published in Maclean's, representing one of the first positive portrayals of gay people in a major Canadian publication. The two-part series was described as fair and objective, and Jim said, "Considering that they were written by someone like Katz who was not gay, the articles were refreshing, non-judgmental for the time, and very informative." Meanwhile, fate couldn't keep the lovers apart. One night in May 1964, by complete coincidence, Jim and Jack ran into each other at the Parkside Tavern at 530 Yonge Street. Jack invited Jim back to the apartment, and the two had a long talk. Jim told Jack that he would abandon the activism work he had been doing if it meant being together, and that he wanted to leave Toronto. The two got back together, and a month later they left Toronto for good, with 3 chihuahuas, ready to begin a new life in British Columbia. For the next 20 years, Jim kept his word and settled into a quiet life with Jack in their new, more welcoming home. Jim and Jack began to live as openly gay men in Merville on Vancouver Island. In 1981, Jim ran for regional director of Electoral Area B of his regional district. He won his election and served from 1981 to 1993. He also became the first openly gay man in a relationship to be elected to public office in Canada. In 1987, Jim applied on Jack's behalf for spousal allowance benefits provided under the Old Age Security Act. Jim Egan and Jack Nesbitt had been a couple for almost 40 years and met all the criteria. Health and Welfare Canada denied the claim because they were a same-sex couple. With that, Jim Egan was called back into being an activist, and he would challenge the decision under the Canadian Charter of Rights and Freedoms. In 1988, their case entered the trial division of the Federal Court of Claim, claiming discrimination under the Old Age Security Act's definition of spouse, which didn't include same-sex relationships and went against Section 15(1) of the Charter. In 1991, the federal court dismissed the case because the court claimed their relationship was not a, quote, spousal one. They appealed, only for the Federal Court of Appeal to rule against them in 1993. The next step was to take their case to the highest court in the land, the Supreme Court of Canada. In May 1995, the Supreme Court dismissed Jack and Jim's appeal. But they also ruled unanimously to include sexual orientation as a prohibited grounds for discrimination in the Charter of Rights and Freedoms. And while Jack and Jim lost the battle, they won the war. This Supreme Court decision set a precedent for several other landmark cases, including Halpern v. Canada in 2003. That case ruled that common law definition of marriage, defined as between a man and a woman, violated Section 15 of the Charter. That decision allowed for the legalization of same-sex marriage in Canada in 2005. Meanwhile, in 1995, following a landmark case, Jack and Jim were made the Grand Marshals of the Toronto Pride Parade. Sadly, Jim Egan didn't get to experience the progress he helped create because he died in March 2000. 3 months later, his lifelong partner, Jack Nesbitt, passed away as well. In 2018, Jim Egan and Jack Nesbitt were the subjects of the first ever LGBTQ Heritage Minute.
I never thought I'd know that feeling. To be in love. Because for us, it was a crime. Someone had to respond to the tabloids. So I wrote letters, challenging every misconception about homosexuality. 9 homes, 7 dogs, 47 years together, and still not spouses under the law. So we took our fight to the Supreme Court.
Jim Egan and Jack Nesbitt await a verdict on their fight for spousal rights.
Hello. We lost our case, but we made a difference.
As a result of Jim Egan's case, the Supreme Court ruled that sexual orientation is protected under the Charter of Rights, a landmark victory for the LGBTQ2 community.
While Jack and Jim were able to change the laws for a more inclusive society, one man had a long legal battle to be pardoned for a crime he never should have been accused of committing. George Clippert was painted as a dangerous offender and punished for no other reason than being gay. George Clippert was born on September 6, 1926, in Kindersley, Saskatchewan, and at the time, being gay was a federal crime. From an early age, Clippert knew that he was gay and that he wouldn't be accepted in society. Men having sex with men was called buggery, which was a major felony. Other sexual acts fell under gross indecency. In 1960, Clippert was working as a transit bus driver when he was charged with and pleaded guilty to 18 counts of gross indecency. He was found guilty and spent 4 years in prison. Upon his release, Clippert moved to Pine Point, Northwest Territories, and began working as a mechanic. In 1965, a series of arsons in the community had police questioning suspects, including Clippert, even though he was not involved in any way. But during questioning, he admitted to police that he had engaged in sexual acts with men. And although he was cleared of suspicion in the arson, he was charged, once again, with gross indecency for having relations with men. He was given little legal representation and was sentenced to 3 years in prison. Because this was his second conviction for gross indecency, the Crown applied to label Clippert as a dangerous sexual offender. To make his decision, Judge John Sissons heard from 2 psychiatrists who stated Clippert had no pedophilic or aggressive tendencies. They described him as a, quote, incurable homosexual, and recommended psychiatric care instead of prison. The judge instead declared Clippert a dangerous offender and sent him to prison. It seemed hopeless, but Clippert had someone in his corner who had his back and wasn't about to sit back and watch him rot in prison for being gay. Everett Clippert's sister, Leah, appealed the conviction and the dangerous offender ruling to the Supreme Court of Canada. Unfortunately, the appeal was unsuccessful. On November 7, 1967, the court ruled 3-2 to uphold the conviction and dangerous offender designation. Now, the appeal may have failed, but the public was outraged. Now, it should be noted that many of those speaking on behalf of Clippert still believed that he had a psychiatric problem because he was attracted to men. They just didn't want him labeled a dangerous offender. Bud Orange, who was Clippert's member of parliament, told CBC that it was ridiculous to put a man in jail because he was afflicted by a quote-unquote social disease. Tommy Douglas, who at the time was the leader of the federal NDP, also spoke out against the ruling, saying, quote, "Homosexuality is a social and psychiatric problem rather than a criminal one." Due to the public pressure, then Justice Minister Pierre Trudeau added the legalization of consensual sex between two men over the age of 20 to his landmark Omnibus Justice Bill. That bill passed in 1969, but Clippert was not released from prison. He remained behind bars until 1971. Upon his release, he had the sad distinction of being the last person in Canadian history to be imprisoned for being gay, and the last to be labeled a dangerous offender because of it. And after his release, he went back to a quiet life. He moved to Edmonton and became a truck driver until he retired in the 1980s. Clippert never set out to change Canadian law, and he refused to be a public figure and never marched in a pride parade. On August 7th, 1996, he died of kidney disease. And he would have disappeared into obscurity were it not for an article in the Globe and Mail in 2016. In it, John Ibbotson told Everett Clippert's story and how his life was interrupted by official injustice and how he was persecuted and punished for being gay. Soon after, Prime Minister Justin Trudeau vowed to pursue a pardon for Clippert, and on November 18, 2020, he was successful. An expungement order was issued by the Parole Board of Canada. While Everett Clippert's long road to justice changed Canadian law, a pioneering trans soul singer contributed to Toronto's R&B music scene, which made her an endearing queer icon in Canada. The story of Jackie Shane begins in Nashville, Tennessee, where she was born on May 15, 1940. At a young age, Jackie felt different from those around her. Blessed with a great deal of confidence, at 5 years old she began to dress as a girl and took inspiration from Mae West's iconic style. Shane was very lucky. Her mother and grandmother both accepted her for who she was and supported her as she began her journey of self-discovery when she came out as transgender at the age of 13. She said in 2017, "Even in school, the other kids accepted me, so did their parents. There was something about me that drew them in." That kind of support in Tennessee was and continues to be rare. In 2023, Tennessee Governor Bill Lee signed into law a total ban on gender-affirming healthcare for transgender children and limited drag performances to the point of almost banning them outright. So imagine how fortunate Shane was to be accepted in the 1950s, although it wasn't without incident. She recalled when a young boy threw rocks at her and verbally accosted her. In response, Shane took her jump rope and whipped him with it. Shane was not only capable, but more than willing to defend herself in the face of verbal and physical attacks. And she also had a gift for performing and a deep love of music. As a young adult, she became close friends with Little Richard, one of the most important figures in rock and roll, and he encouraged her to explore the R&B and soul scene in Nashville. She frequented clubs and performed at many of them. As her singing career developed, Shane found that the early acceptance she experienced in life was going to get harder as Nashville audiences were openly hostile to her because she was not only black but transgender. Feeling that she would fare better away from the American Deep South, her friend, soul singer Joe Tex, encouraged her to move. After stops in Boston and Montreal, she arrived in Toronto in 1959, where she felt she had found a home. She stated, quote, "One cannot choose where one is born, but you can choose your home. I choose Toronto. I love Toronto. I love Canadian people. I consider myself a part of them." Shane arrived in Toronto just as the city was becoming a music beacon in Canada. As she rose in the R&B scene, people like Neil Young, Joni Mitchell, and Gordon Lightfoot were cutting their teeth at the city's clubs, coffee shops, and bars. And it didn't take long for Shane to be performing sold-out shows at nightclubs throughout the city and even appearing on local music television shows. She released several singles, including a cover of You Are My Sunshine in the early 1960s. In 1963, her cover of William Bell's Any Other Way hit number 2 on the Chum singles chart. Before she knew it, she was becoming a central figure in shaping what became known as the Toronto Sound, a style of R&B unique to the city. Sadly, throughout her entire career, she was misidentified by the press as a man who performed in ambiguous clothing that suggested femininity. Some simply called her a drag queen. Whenever she was asked about her gender, she typically dodged the question. Behind closed doors with her mother, she identified as a woman, but in the public eye, she preferred to ignore labels related to her sexuality and gender. In 1967, Shane released a live album, the only album she ever did. She shied away from releasing studio albums because she didn't trust music labels. And it wasn't like they didn't try to sign her. Both Motown and Atlantic Records approached her, and legendary funk musician George Clinton attempted to convince her to join his iconic band, Parliament Funkadelic. For Shane, though, it was never about making records. What she loved more than anything was performing in front of a crowd. She said, quote, "I've never really wanted to record. I get my charge from performing in front of people. That is my energy." Then, almost as soon as she burst onto the music scene of Toronto, she left it all behind. In 1971, Shane retired from music, moved to Los Angeles, and cared for her aging mother. The two later moved back to Nashville and lived together until her mother's death in 1997. From then on, Shane settled for a quiet life in Nashville. As the years went on, the media incorrectly reported that she had died by suicide or been stabbed to death in a home robbery. Neither were true. Shane was simply avoiding the public eye. But a talent like hers could not stay hidden forever. In the 2010s, a new generation discovered her, and the CBC released a radio documentary titled I Got Mine, The Jackie Shane Story. 5 years later, her 1967 live album, Jackie Shane Live, was reissued and was shortlisted for Polaris Music Prize. This was followed in 2017 by an anthology album from her career that included monologues from her live shows. Called Any Other Way, the album earned a Grammy nomination in 2019 for Best Historic Album. With her music being rediscovered, she said, "I had been discovered. It wasn't what I wanted, but I feel good about it. After such a long time, people still cared. And now those people who are just discovering me, it is just overwhelming." In 2019, Shave gave a rare interview with CBC Radio 1's Q. The interview was conducted by Elaine Banks, who is the producer of I Got Mine. It was Shane's first major interview since she left the spotlight behind almost 50 years earlier. And then on February 21st, 2019, Shane died in her sleep. In 2022, a Heritage Minute was released about her life, and she has been honored with a massive mural on the side of a building of Yonge Street in Toronto. On June 23, 2023, Jackie Shane Day was declared in the city, and that day, a Heritage Toronto plaque was unveiled honoring Shane's life at the site of the former Sapphire Tavern, where she often performed, and the ceremony also marked the start of Pride Week.
Long way from Nashville, and mama, I tell you that. Performed from Montreal to Boston to Los Angeles. But Toronto, that's my chosen home. Sure, when I'm walking down Yonge Street, I see some funny people who have the nerve to point the finger at me. And grin and smile and whisper. My song was #2 on local radio. Sold 10,000 in Toronto alone. Turned down Ed Sullivan because they asked me to remove my makeup. Wouldn't do American Bandstand because of their segregation policies. I was just being me, never tried to explain myself to anyone. And besides, none of that don't worry, Jackie, because I know I look good. Got a new way of loving, baby. Thought I want to teach it to you.
Jackie Shane was a pioneer transgender soul singer, a central figure in the Toronto R&B scene. She helped shape what we know as the Toronto sound.
3 years after Jackie Shane left the music scene to care for her mother, 4 women walked into a Toronto bar to sing karaoke. They would become known as the Brunswick Four. On a cool evening, Adrienne Rosen, formerly Adrienne Potts, Pat Murphy, Sue Wells, and Lamar Van Dyke, formerly Heather Elizabeth Nelson, walked into the Brunswick Tavern in Toronto. The 4 friends were out on January 5, 1974 and having fun performing during amateur night. They took the Rodgers and Hammerstein song, I Enjoy Being a Girl, and changed the lyrics to I Enjoy Being a Dyke. Although their performance was met with applause, their own version of the song drew the ire of the bar's owner, and several men in the crowd became angry. The 4 were refused service and told to leave. When they refused, the police were called. A few minutes later, 8 police officers dragged the women from the venue to arrest them, injuring 2 of them in the process. Adding insult to injury, the Brunswick Four have stated that the police made inappropriate and harassing comments while escorting them to the station. While they were not charged with a crime, the women were refused their right to a lawyer during their detention, and they protested their arrest by refusing to leave the police station. Police forcibly ejected them, and Adrienne Rosen was punched in the back of the head by an officer. Hoping to find witnesses, they returned to the Brunswick house and were met by 2 uniformed officers, 2 bouncers, and 2 plainclothes detectives. For the second time, the 4 women were put into a police car and taken to a station. This time, they were not asked to leave. Instead, they sat in the station for the next 4 hours as police made sexist and homophobic remarks. Rosen, Murphy, and Van Dyke were charged with creating a disturbance. Van Dyke was also charged with obstructing the police. Their lawyer would be Judy LaMarche, a former member of Parliament and the second woman to hold a federal cabinet position in Canadian history. She was outraged over the treatment by police and insisted on representing the women pro bono. The Toronto gay community also rallied around the women and formed the Brunswick 4-1 Defense Fund to help them with any legal fees. In May 1974, all charges were dismissed except for Adrienne Rosen, who was convicted in the charge of creating disturbance against. She was given a suspended sentence and placed on 3 months probation. Over the course of the trial, the full extent of the abuse the 4 experienced at the hands of police also came to light. Pat Murphy testified that she overheard one of the police officers say that the women should be shot. Afterwards, Rosen, Murphy, and Van Dyke charged the officers that arrested them with assault. They produced evidence that included doctor's notes and photographs of the bruises on their bodies. What the women didn't know was that while they were being arrested on that January night, the officers swapped their hats and badge numbers among themselves to prevent identification. Upon learning this, Rosen, Murphy, and Van Dyke all refused to participate in the trial, calling it a miscarriage of justice. When the trial began and the clerk asked everyone to rise, the women stayed seated in protest. When they were ordered to rise again, they didn't budge. All 3 were charged with criminal contempt of court and taken to jail cells. Rosen and Van Dyke apologized a few hours later, but Murphy did not. And for that, she spent 30 days in jail. She was the only person to be imprisoned over the entire incident because every officer involved in their violent arrest was acquitted. While the Brunswick Four were in court, 2 men got married, even as their union was not recognized by law. That would come decades later. In 1974, Chris Vogel and Richard North walked into the first Unitarian Universalist church in Winnipeg, said their vows, and became the first Canadian same-sex couple to be married in a church. The church may have recognized their union, but the Manitoba government refused to register their marriage or even grant the couple a license. The couple filed a lawsuit against the provincial government, but the case was dismissed on the basis that the dictionary definition of marriage did not include same-sex unions. Told their legal case was hopeless, Vogel and North went about their lives together as a married couple in every sense except the law. By the dawn of the 21st century, there was a growing acceptance of same-sex marriage in Canada. Ontario, British Columbia, Quebec, and the Yukon had all recognized same-sex marriage by the summer of 2004. Seeing the changing tide, North and Vogel, along with 2 other same-sex couples, launched a lawsuit titled Vogel v. Canada on August 26, 2004, which argued the ban on marriage licenses to same-sex couples violated the Canadian Charter of Rights and Freedoms. Manitoba Justice Minister Gordon McIntosh said, quote, "We will not oppose what they are seeking. We don't have an interest in opposing legally recognized rights of Canadians. I think the weight of the decisions across the country have pointed to the conclusion that the current federal law is not in accordance with the Charter, so I am pleased that we're going to have some definite ruling here in Manitoba." On September 16, 2004, Justice Douglas Yard of the Court of Queen's Bench of Manitoba ordered the province to issue marriage licenses to same-sex couples. And while many couples did marry, Vogel and North did not remarry. They argued they were married in 1974 and didn't need to do it over again. All they wanted was a marriage license that recognized their original union. In 2018, a human rights adjudicator ruled that he was legally bound by the 1974 ruling against Vogel and North, stating there was nothing to register because there had been no marriage. Since the ruling, nearly 1,000 same-sex couples have married in Manitoba, but not the 2 who started it all. as of this recording in June 2024, the original marriage of Vogel and North has not been recognized by the Manitoba government. The battleground for the LGBTQ2S+ rights seems to always be in the courts, and a teacher was at the center of a landmark provincial and federal legal case concerning the inclusion of sexual orientation as a protected human right in Canada. His name? Delwyn Vrend. Delwyn Vrend's story begins in 1966 in Iowa, where he was born. When he was 2, his family moved to an organic vegetable farm near Edmonton, and as a child he attended a private Christian elementary school and eventually enrolled in King's College in Edmonton. He later transferred to Calvin College in Michigan, where he earned a degree in physics and mathematics. And after some time working as an electrician, he was offered a position as a laboratory coordinator and chemistry instructor at King's College. The contract was for 3 years at the Canadian Christian University. Delwyn was also involved in a same-sex relationship at the time, which was something he was open about in his church congregation. But word soon reached his bosses at King's College, and they promptly fired him, stating his sexual orientation was not compatible with the statement of religious belief adopted by the college. Delwyn immediately filed a complaint with the Alberta Human Rights Commission. This went nowhere, as they refused his complaint because sexual orientation was not protected in the Human Rights Code of Alberta. He then sued both the Government of Alberta and the Alberta Human Rights Commission. Following his termination from the college, Delwyn was unemployed for 9 months before he found work with the AIDS Network of Edmonton Society. 3 years after he was dismissed, an Alberta court ruled that sexual orientation had to be protected under human rights legislation. So, the Alberta government appealed the decision. 2 years later, the Alberta Court of Appeal overruled the lower court's decision. Sexual orientation was not a protected right. Delwyn was not about to give up without a fight, even if it had been 5 years since he lost his job. He took his case all the way to the Supreme Court of Canada. On April 2, 1998, the Supreme Court ruled that provincial governments could not exclude protection of individuals from human rights legislation based on their sexual orientation. It was a landmark decision that not only protected LGBTQ2S+ rights in Alberta, but across the country. Many groups in Alberta did lobby the provincial government to use the notwithstanding clause, which gives a province the ability to overrule a federal decision, but the province didn't support the case any further. The decision was a victory for Delwyn, who was now working for the University of Alberta Library. But in 2000, the publicity surrounding the case forced the reluctant gay rights hero to seek refuge in Paris, and he left Canada behind. But Canadians didn't forget about him, as he was ranked 44th on Alberta Venture's list of the 50 greatest Albertans of Albertans' first century in 2005. And 6 years later, he was inducted into the Q Hall of Fame Canada. But his Supreme Court case became a basis for provincial cases against the ban on same-sex marriage in Canada, leading to its legalization nationwide. And I think that will make one more interesting story to tell this episode. The official road to legalizing same-sex marriage began with its legalization in Ontario on June 10, 2003, followed by BC on July 8, 2003, and the Yukon on March 19, 2004. Over the course of the next year and a half, every province and territory except Alberta, Prince Edward Island, Nunavut, and the Northwest Territories legalized same-sex marriage. By then, numerous court cases were entitling same-sex couples to an increasing number of rights. These were cases like MVH in 1999, which ruled same-sex couples in Canada were entitled to the same financial and legal benefits of traditional marriages, or Halpern v. Canada in 2002, and Hendricks and Leboeuf v. Quebec in 2003, which ruled that same-sex marriage ban was discriminatory. Public opinion was changing. In 1996, 49% of Canadians supported same-sex marriage. That number increased to 53% within 3 years. By February 1, 2005, when Liberal Justice Minister Erwin Coulter introduced the Civil Marriage Act to Parliament, 3,000 same-sex couples had already married in Canada. About 90% of the Canadian population now lived in a province that had legalized same-sex marriage. Over the next few months, the Act went through its first and second readings and survived a Conservative Party motion against the bill on April 12, 2005. On May 4, 2005, the bill passed its second reading in Parliament. And through all of this, the minority government of Paul Martin survived multiple confidence votes that could have brought down the government and forced an election which would have killed the bill. On June 23, 2005, the Liberal Party, Bloc Québécois, and NDP voted to extend the sitting time of Parliament so that Bill C-38 could pass its third reading. 5 days later, a vote was held on the final reading. Nearly every NDP, Bloc, and Liberal MP voted in favor of it. The Conservative Party was nearly unanimously voting against it. The Civil Marriage Act passed with a vote of 158 to 133, and then moved on to the Senate, where it passed, and on July 20th, 2005, at 4:45 p.m., Bill C-38 received royal assent from Chief Justice Beverly McLaughlin, the first female Chief Justice of the Supreme Court of Canada. She was serving as acting Governor General while Adrienne Clarkson was recovering from surgery. And with that royal assent, Canada became the fourth country in the world, and the first outside of Europe, to legalize same-sex marriage throughout its borders. Today, same-sex marriage is legal in 37 countries around the world. In 2011, adoption by same-sex couples was legalized nationwide, and conversion therapy was banned in 2022. Now, Canada isn't perfect by any means, and in some provinces it feels like we're stepping backwards, but we've come a long way to becoming more tolerant. I'll leave you today with a quote from Marsha P. Johnson. "History isn't something you look back at and say, it was inevitable. It happens because people make decisions that are sometimes very impulsive and of the moment. But those moments are cumulative realities. And remember, you never completely have rights until we all have rights. And also, protect trans kids." This show is researched, produced, and written by me, Craig Baird, with the help of Dila Velasquez. Audio production and design by Rosalind Kufor. If this is your first time listening and you like what you heard, please take a moment and give us a 5-star review to help other people find these amazing stories. And there are so many for you to sink your teeth into. If you enjoy this podcast, then please check out my other podcasts, From John to Justin, Canada, A Yearly Journey, Pucks and Cups, and Canada's Great War. We love hearing from you, so if you have a show topic you want me to cover, email me at craig@canadaehx.com. Or stop by my website and social media. I'll include all of those in my show notes. Until next time, I'm Craig Baird, and this is Canadian History X.